I'd like to start our time together with a short reading. These are the words of Jack Kornfield, which I think will help to set a tone for the big picture reasons that we're all gathered here today. He writes, "My simple prayer is that in all things I learn to love well, that I learn to touch the ever-changing seasons of life with a great heart of compassion, that I live with the peace and justice I wish for the earth, that I learn to care fully and let go gracefully, that I enjoy the abundance of the earth and return to it from the natural generosity that is our human birthright, that through my own life, through joy and sorrow, in thought, word, and deed, I bring benefit and blessings to all that lives, that my heart and the hearts of all beings learn to be free." This topic of aging and awakening is one that's been close to my heart actually my whole life. Interestingly, one of the really important figures in my upbringing was my maternal grandmother, who was a very simple and kind Jewish peasant woman from Russia who came over on a boat that made her quite seasick when she was a child. And she was very much a part of our family life in such a way that I got to spend time with her. She would babysit along with my grandfather sometimes for my brother and myself. And there were certain qualities that she had that were so different from the qualities of the other adults that I spent time with, most of whom were upwardly mobile, middle-class working people in an upwardly mobile, middle-class suburban atmosphere. My grandmother moved at a slower pace and had a certain quality of presence that I didn't experience very often with adults. In particular, what I remember when I look back on it, although I didn't have the words for it at the time, was that she didn't seem to have an agenda for me, that I needed to be productive somehow. It was as if she didn't buy into the script that our culture trained people to buy into, that our self-worth and our productivity are one and the same thing. Rather, she seemed to recognize what the perennial wisdom teachings were saying for millennia, that the simple fact that we exist is an expression of our inherent sacredness. And she probably wouldn't have had language for any of what I'm talking about, but she conveyed that message to me in the way that her face lit up when I simply walked into the room. I didn't have to perform for her, which was a tremendous blessing in my life. And it led me to realize that I liked spending time with older people. They moved at a slower pace. They often had more of a sense of intention about what they were doing. And there was a calm and an ease that I often experienced, especially with my grandmother, but with other elders as well, that really made an impression on me. A second contribution to my interest in the aging process was the hospice work that Bev mentioned. For reasons I may never understand, I had a lot of early and sudden traumatic losses when I was young. And part of my need to assimilate those losses and deal with the grief and confusion that trauma creates led me to be interested in working with people at the end of their lives. A major part of that was the work of Ram Dass and Stephen Levine, a couple of respected spiritual teachers whose work I valued and appreciated. And in the early 70s, when they started working with people who were dying and at the end of their lives, I was very inspired by the stories they were telling in their talks and eventually writing about in their books, one of which was an important book that Stephen Levine wrote in 1979 called Who Dies? An Investigation of Conscious Living and Conscious Dying. There was one other experience that stimulated my interest even more in the aging process, and that was years later when I was on the faculty of Naropa University teaching in the transpersonal psychology program. And the religious studies department at the university was given a grant to create a chair called the World Wisdom Chair. So this was about, I would say, 1995 or 6. One of the first recipients of that chair was someone who Bev mentioned in that introduction, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who some years before had started a conscious aging organization called the Spiritual Eldering Institute, in part because of his own vision that we needed to have a healthier, wiser, and more life-affirming view of the aging process in our culture than we have. He recognized, as many of us have, I suspect, that the negative images and models that are pervasive in our culture in relation to aging are problematic in many different ways. One of the most important of which involves what social psychologists call the self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. When Reb Zalman came to Naropa, the short form of the story is we just clicked completely. And it was a delight to meet an elder who valued and celebrated being an elder. In the vocabulary of Naropa, we talked about Reb Zalman as someone who, quote, knew how to take his seat as an elder in the society. Whereas so many of us, given the negative imagery and messaging that goes on throughout much of our lives and in various aspects of the media, we're given messages that somehow aging diminishes us and makes us less valuable of a human being, which of course is ludicrous if we look at the fact that we're the exception for the most part in the modern West. Indigenous cultures throughout the ages have recognized that the elders who had synthesized wisdom from long life experience were the people to go to when decisions needed to be made. These people in indigenous cultures are what are called the lineage holders or the wisdom keepers. And they're the ones who are believed to have the insight to see 7 generations into the future, rather than being diminished and pushed off to the side. In Reb Zalman's words, like an old shoe in a certain sense. Yeah. When I met Reb Zalman, pretty quickly he invited me to join the board of directors of the Institute, Spiritual Eldering Institute at that time it was called. He had developed a training program to train and certify what were called certified saging leaders, people who were being sent out like emissaries, in effect, to share his perspective on how we could, in his words, shift the paradigm for aging in our culture. And I was enthusiastic enough about the work that I decided to train as a certified saging leader. And after teaching seminars and workshops around the country for about 18 months, I was hired to be their education and training director. My passion for the work was fueled by the same passion that fueled my work in hospice for a number of years, which was the recognition that a great deal of the suffering associated with dying in our culture and also with aging in our culture is unnecessary. While on one level, there are certain existential givens associated with aging and dying, and a certain kind of existential suffering attendant to those processes, how we respond to those experiences either adds additional suffering to those experiences or allows us to see them as part of a natural unfolding that every human life includes. Right? How powerful and important are our beliefs about aging, or about dying in this case? Well, consider this piece of research. This is from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, August of 2002. The abstract summarizes it this way. It's called Longevity Increased by Positive Self-Perceptions of Aging. This research found that older individuals with more positive self-perceptions of aging measured up to 23 years earlier lived 7.5 years longer than those with less positive self-perceptions of aging. This is the part that's important here too. This advantage remained after age, gender, socioeconomic status, loneliness, and functional health were included as covariates. In other words, they isolated the role of the belief one had about the meaning of becoming an older human being. And that factor in and of itself enabled people with positive self-perceptions to live 7.5 years longer. So think about that for a moment, right? Imagine what would happen if some pharmaceutical company created a pill that would allow us to live 7.5 years longer. It would be paraded across the headline of the New York Times in 2-inch letters. Right? This particular piece, I don't think even made it into the newspaper. Right? But it does, it's a powerful reflection of how important our views of aging actually are and what role they play in the quality of our lives and the extent to which we suffer or find well-being and joy and meaning and satisfaction in our lives. Yeah. What I invite you to consider that I think comes into play here is that I'm in no way whatsoever advocating any kind of Pollyanna perspective on the difficult parts of aging. I've been someone who has witnessed as a hospice worker, as a trauma therapist, and in many other situations with poverty in Nepal, I've seen how difficult aging can be, and I'm in no denial about it whatsoever. Right? At the same time, what I think is helpful to recognize here, if we're interested in the spiritual and psychological aspects of aging, is that this notion of how we respond to the changes inherent in the aging process and seeing our responses as determinants of what we experience is of critical importance. Yeah. So what happens, for example, take a moment and just in your own way, reflect inside yourself on some of the aspects of aging that you don't like and find difficult. And let yourself lean into them without pulling any punches, so to speak. Just make a little mental list, right? Maybe memory function is challenging, right? Maybe sleep is disrupted more easily. Perhaps loneliness is a challenge. For some of us, feeling invisible and unimportant comes into play. One person, when I did this at a workshop, I had people call out things, and one person said, losing your glasses. And then after a pause, she said, and then finding them on your forehead. Right? But notice, right, we all have these kinds of realities that we have to deal with. Right? I'll be 72 next month, for example. When I first got involved with this work, I was 46. So when I taught workshops on aging, I was a little apologetic, basically, and I introduced myself as an elder in training, so that I would acknowledge that I could have been the son of any of the people at the workshop in many cases, right? However, at 72 almost, a month from, the challenging parts of aging are not so theoretical anymore, right? My knees don't do now what they did as a 23-year-old yoga teacher. No question about it, right? Here's what I want you to try as a thought experiment, though, right? Rather than considering the list of difficulties that you just reflected upon as some kind of problem, first of all, that indicates that there's something wrong with you or that you're less than in any way, shape, or form, right? What happens if you choose to see dealing with those changes as a curriculum for spiritual awakening and realization? And what I'm talking about here is the fact that all of the great wisdom traditions, in their own way, talk about the fact that our relationship to change is a primary determinant of our level of suffering or happiness. Let me say that in a different way. To the extent that we can learn to relate to change with wisdom and compassion, the difficulties in our lives become a spiritual curriculum that deepen our compassion for ourselves and others and allow us to move through the world as wounded healers whose love is very deep and profound. Yeah. To the extent that we resist, fear, and resent change, as the culture teaches us to do in relation to aging, we end up adding what in Buddhist tradition is called the second arrow to the difficulties associated with aging by virtue of our emotional response. Does this make any sense, or does it sound a little psychotic? You tell me. Yeah? This is really what Buddhist and other contemplative traditions are trying to teach. They're trying to teach us to turn toward instead of away from the changing aspects of our lives, because life is inherently a process of change. And then to open into the changes with what I call loving curiosity, a certain kind of interest and engagement that allows us to embrace what's happening without the kind of resistance that adds to the suffering on top of the existential difficulty. Yeah? Let me give you an example of what I mean when I talk about models of aging, because our culture has problematic models on so many levels. And this one you might appreciate. This is from one of our great cultural sages, His Holiness George Carlin. Consider, he writes, do you realize that the only time in our lives when we like to get old is when we're kids? If you're less than 10 years old, you're so excited about aging, you think in fractions. How old are you? I'm 4.5. You're never 36.5. You're 4.5 going on 5. That's the key. You get into your teens, now they can't hold you back. You jump to the next number, even a few ahead. How old are you? I'm going to be 16. You could be 13, but hey, you're going to be 16. And then the greatest day of your life, you become 21. Even the words sound like a ceremony. You become 21. Yes. But then you turn 30. Ooh, what happened there? Makes you sound like bad milk. He turned. We had to throw him out. There's no fun now. You're just a sour dumpling. What's wrong? What's changed? You become 21, you turn 30, then you're pushing 40. Whoa, put on the brakes. It's all slipping away. Before you know it, you reach 50 and your dreams are gone. But wait, you make it to 60. You didn't think you would. So you become 21, turn 30, push 40, reach 50, and you make it to 60. You've built up so much speed, you hit 70. After that, it's a day-by-day thing. You hit Wednesday. You get into your 80s, and every day is a complete cycle. You hit lunch, you turn 4:30, you reach bedtime. And it doesn't end there. Into the 90s, you start going backwards. I was just 92. Then a strange thing happens. If you make it to 100, you become a little kid again. I'm 100 and a half. May you all make it to a healthy 100 and a half. Okay? Now, it's funny on one level, yeah? And at the same time, perhaps if you're like me, you notice that it hurts your heart a little bit because it's pointing out certain realities that we've all grown up with. Right? Yeah, I remember sitting with a psychotherapy client who was very depressed because he was a writer and he was 29 and he was coming on 30 and he hadn't made it as a writer yet. And he felt like he'd kind of blown it, right? It was too late because he was going to be over the hill when he hit 30 symbolically. Yeah. Those are the kind of messages we get. And they go in when we're young. They go in by virtue of films that we watch and stories we hear about elders and so forth. And part of this notion of aging and awakening is flushing that out of our system so that we're less likely to create that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, which represents exactly what we fear most about getting older. Is this making some sense? Can you relate to some of this? Right? For a number of years, when I was with the Institute, I collaborated with a friend of mine who's a professor at Loyola College in Baltimore, a man named Drew Leader, who's a fascinating friend and figure. Originally, he trained as a physician and then realized that he didn't like practicing medicine. So he went back and he got a doctorate in East-West philosophy. And that's what he's been teaching for his career. Right? And we found at the Institute that we had taught our basic saging course, certified saging course, to many people at a certain point, and they started to want more material that we hadn't developed yet. So we needed a kind of a 202 level, and Drew and I put together a course called The Tao of Aging, drawing on the Taoist philosophy of China. Part of why it was interesting to work with Drew is because he had been given a grant in the mid-90s to study the prevalent models of aging in our society and had written about them in a number of places, including one of the books that he has written. And I want to say a little bit about the models that Drew identified and how they relate to what I'm talking about here today, right? The first of the models that Drew identified, he called the socio-medical model, right? The socio-medical model. This is the model we see in healthcare for the most part, in geriatric medicine and psychiatry and gerontology, physical therapy, social work, and so forth. And it has a wonderful side to it because there are a lot of physical and psychological and emotional difficulties that sometimes need to be addressed as we live our lives and become older. Right? So many of the people who do that work are wonderful and do very compassionate and kind work to help alleviate some of the suffering that can be alleviated. At the same time, it's a pretty two-dimensional perspective. There's a tendency for many people in the medical community to look at treating the symptoms without recognizing the fullness of the life of the person who's sitting before them. So there's some limitations associated with that perspective. A second model that Drew identified, he labeled the productive model. This is the model that also has a positive element to it. It's the model that says use it or lose it, right? Use your brain and keep it active and work with it, and do the crossword puzzles or keep writing or try learning a new language so you can keep your mind functioning well, which is backed up by good neuroscientific research and is simply true. Yeah. It's also said that you have to move your body and try to keep it flexible and maintain as much physical health as you can to the extent that you're able, which also makes good sense, right? At the same time, when we've grown up in a culture that, as I said earlier, equates productivity with self-worth, and we naturally start slowing down, it's very difficult not to take a significant dip in self-esteem if we are unconsciously equating our productivity in the eyes of the world with our value as a human being. Yeah. So when we go through midlife into late life, I think it's important to recognize that our internal spiritual agenda often begins to change. We feel pulled, for example, to reflect upon the life that we've lived and to extract the learning from our life experiences. Perhaps we are drawn to be quieter than we were when we were in more active stages of our lives. Or in some cases, we might feel we want to be more outrageous because it's less consequential in certain respects, right? The downside of the productive model is what Reb Zalman described it with the extreme example of the 100-year-old former bank executive who doesn't know how to do anything but be a bank executive. Even though he's retirement age, he still goes into the bank and opens and closes the door for people at the bank because he doesn't want to step out of identification with that role of somebody who's important in the banking world. There's an unwillingness to look at who I am now when I'm not identified with a role that has a certain kind of power associated with it. Yeah. So that can be problematic in a different way. The third model that Drew identified, he called the consumer model. Right? This is the model that basically says, now it's my turn. I've paid my dues, I've worked my job. If I had a family, I've put my children through college or helped them find their way, right? And now I can do what I wanted to do because I had to defer a lot of gratification when I was younger, when I was paying off a mortgage or whatever I might have been doing, right? Now I can play the golf that I want to play or go on a cruise I've always wanted to go on or visit a country, see what the Galapagos are like and something of that sort, right? And I can relate to that one. I know when my daughter left for college, it was champagne time on one level, as much as I love her to this day, and she lives 10 minutes away in her condominium, and it's very much a part of my life and my wife's life together. It felt kind of celebratory to have hit that marking point, if you will, right? What's also true is that for many thoughtful people who have a certain kind of spiritual depth that's a part of who we are, playing a lot of golf is not necessarily sufficiently meaningful for what we want to be doing with, say, the last third of our lives. Even if we read the Zen of golf, right, or the Tao of golf, it might not be sufficient to imbue that activity with the kind of meaning and purpose and sense of mission that we might want to have for our lives. Yeah? So those are the three main models that Drew identified. What was exciting to me about Reb Zalman's work was that he was proposing a third model. A fourth model. He was suggesting that we have a spiritually oriented model for the last third of life, and that we focus on that curriculum that I described earlier as one way to understand that. Right? The idea here is that we as human beings on the spiritual, psychological, and emotional levels are part of a developmental process that begins early on. Even children, you can see beginning signs of spiritual seeking when they're young. For example, there was a study done with children 4 to 8 years old, in which they asked these kids to talk about what the word love meant to them as a kind of a baseline assessment, since love is so central to all the great wisdom traditions. These were some of their answers. Love is that first feeling you feel before all the bad stuff gets in the way, right? Here's another one. Love is when a girl puts on perfume and a boy puts on shaving cologne and they go out and smell each other. Love is when your puppy licks your face even after you left him alone for the entire day. Right? Some of you know that one, I'm sure. When you love somebody, your eyelashes go up and down and little stars come out of you. Right? Now, here's one probably from an older kid. You can see the developmental movement here, right? When you tell someone something bad about yourself and you're scared they won't love you anymore, but they love you even more. That surprises you because you thought you were bad and they loved you even more, right? So that's the early part of that process where we as human beings can see ourselves as having a spiritual developmental process that's in movement. What happens when we look at the other end of that spectrum, at some of the elders who have really matured and done their inner developmental work and brought some of the best human qualities we have to full fruition? This is an excerpt from an essay by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, written at the age of 90. How much easier it is then, how much more receptive we are to death when advancing years guide us softly to our end. Aging thus is in no sense a punishment from on high, but brings us its own blessings and warmth of colors all its own. There is even warmth to be drawn from the waning of your own strength as compared with the past. Just to think how sturdy I once used to be. You can no longer get through a whole day's work at one stretch, but how good it is to slip into the brief oblivion of sleep. And what a gift to wake once more to the clarity of your second or third morning of the day. And your spirit can find delight in limiting your intake of food, in abandoning the pursuit of novel flavors. You are still of this life, yet you are rising above the material plane. Growing old serenely is not a downhill path, but an ascent. The first time I read that, I thought he must come from another planet, because his view was so at odds with what I had been given by this culture. And then I had the good fortune to start working with elders all over the country, and in some cases outside of this country. And I met many, many people who had a view closer to Solzhenitsyn's than the one I had grown up with. Another example that I like is from a a woman named Polly Francis, who was a well-known fashion illustrator and photographer who was invited to write a series of articles when she was in her 90s that were published in the Washington Post. This is how she described her 90s. A new set of faculties seems to be coming into operation. I seem to be awakening to a larger world of wonderment, to catch little glimpses of the immensity and diversity of creation. More than at any other time in my life, I seem to be aware of the beauties of our spinning planet and the sky above. And now I have the time to enjoy them. I feel that old age sharpens our awareness. What a different perspective relative to what I see and hear in films that stereotype elders as feeble-minded and incapable. Not to say that the challenges aren't real, but that we don't want to have that model as the predominant lens through which we see what's unfolding in our lives. Right? So this kind of spiritual model is one that Reb Zalman discovered because of the models of diminishment in the culture. When he was approaching 60, he went into a deep depression. Right? Now, this is someone who had been super productive. He had started a whole new branch of the Jewish tradition called Jewish Renewal. In the course of his lifetime, he personally ordained somewhere around 200 rabbis. He wrote over 150 published articles. Talk about productive. However, as he was approaching 60, he went into this dark depression and didn't know why. So Reb Zalman, being who he was, he went down to a place in New Mexico in the mountains above Taos called the Lama Foundation, where I used to live during part of the 80s. And he went into what we called the High Hermitage and spent 40 days in isolation, looking deeply into the depression he was experiencing. And what he saw was that all of those negative beliefs and attitudes he'd been given by the culture were coming home to roost. And even though he knew that he had much to contribute and was someone who clearly had a place in the society, it felt like the arising into his consciousness of all these negative messages were what created the depression. So he began to create various exercises and journal writing techniques and guided meditations that he used for himself, and emerged after 40 days with a vision that his task in life was now to be someone to help shift the paradigm of aging in the culture. Unfortunately, he knew Ram Dass quite well, and the two of them got together and began to collaborate in terms of working on that task. Yeah. It's true that clearly our needs and wants and desires change as we get older. That's real. At the same time, what Zalman saw was that what our society needs in many ways more than anything else is the blessings of elder wisdom. Sadly, we've stratified our society horizontally for the most part. The 20-somethings hang out with the 20-somethings, the 30-somethings with the 30-somethings, and the elders in gated communities in some cases where they don't even see young people except for visiting grandchildren. But what's sad about that is that the intergenerational contact gets lost. The elders don't have the meaning and purpose of mentoring and passing along what they've learned, and the young people don't have the guidance that they would benefit from people who have lived longer and come to understand more about life. Okay? So that's what fuels this process, and what helps me want to continue to do this kind of work, essentially. Anne mentioned at one point that we might do a little bit of a meditation practice. I thought I'd try something with you related to some of what I've been talking about. And let me just preface it by saying, if you're not familiar with meditation, um, you can relax in the sense that I'm a really easy grader. That was part of my reputation at Naropa. And at the same time, there's not really a right or wrong way to do this little guided meditation that I'm going to lead us through. It's more a matter of think of it in the spirit of discovery, and let's just see what we can learn. And then maybe we'll talk about it a little bit before we close and have some conversation. So if you'd like to participate in that, what you want to do is find a comfortable seated position. I'm going to grab something here. You want to sit essentially with your head, neck, and your back in comfortable alignment if you can. If you're comfortable doing so, you can close your eyes, and if you prefer, you could leave them open, but perhaps with a slight downward angle and a soft focus. And to begin with, I would invite you to simply notice the sensations associated with your breath as the breath comes in and goes out. Not controlling the breath or manipulating it, but attending to the felt sensations of the breath in your body, perhaps at the belly or the chest or the tip of the nose. And allowing the breath to come and go of its own accord, as if you were being breathed by life. If your mind wanders away or you get involved in thoughts and so forth, it's not a problem. Just gently redirect your attention to the felt sensations of the breath in your body. And in the vocabulary of meditation, let your attention ride the breath the way you would ride a horse moving at a gentle pace. And as you do this, to the extent possible, allow your mind stream to settle the way silt settles to the bottom of a pond when you stop stirring it. And now I'd like you to bring to mind a difficulty associated with aging that you experience that you'd like to learn a little bit more about. One of the parts of growing older that came to mind earlier, and essentially identify what that is, and sense that difficulty and the way you're experiencing it in your life presently. And as you do that, as you sense that difficulty, notice how it affects your body. Notice how it affects your heart. Notice how it affects your mind. And now as you continue to feel inwardly, carefully, I'm going to pose a series of questions and pause after each one for a short time, during which I would invite you to listen to what responses come from your own deepest compassion and wisdom. How have I treated this difficulty so far? How have I suffered by my own response and reaction to it? What does this problem ask me to let go of? What suffering is unavoidable? Something I simply must accept. What great lesson might this difficulty be able to teach me? What might be the gold, the value hidden in this situation? And then gently use your body awareness to come back into the seat that you're sitting in and the room that you're in. I'm going to allow some time after we take a break shortly to see if anybody would share anything about what you noticed. Um, but I thought I would just kind of briefly review what it is I'm trying to convey, and then bring my speaking to a close so we can have some dialogue and discussion. Yeah. Um, Essentially, what I'm suggesting to you is that um, if we have the eyes to see it, there's a way in which the process of growing older and the difficulties associated with it can become a curriculum for the actualization of our best human qualities, the qualities that we see in all of the great wisdom traditions, like compassion, wisdom, joy, patience, generosity, and kindness. And I spent a fair amount of time talking about some of the obstacles to that unfolding process in relation to the life negative images of aging that we've been given by our culture. I pointed out several that Drew talked about in his research. That is the socio-medical model, which has its pluses but also has the downside of a kind of two-dimensional perspective on human beings oftentimes, where symptoms are being treated, but not other important aspects of the person's experience. I talked about the productive model, in which we equate our self-worth with our productivity and thereby experience diminishing self-esteem when we move into a more contemplative or different stage of living. I talked about the consumer model, which has its upside and its pluses for sure, and some wonderful aspects to it, and yet limitations for some of us who are interested in continuing to explore the deeper meaning of our lives. And then I proposed a model that I learned from Reb Zalman and other people who were interested in the processes of these days being called conscious aging, in which we intentionally choose this perspective that we are evolutionary beings on the spiritual level in the same way that we are on the biological level, and that evolution is supported by a vision of coming into elderhood and taking our seat as elders in a society that right now, on a planet right now, that needs as much elder wisdom and compassion as we can muster. Yeah. What we come to see about the aging process and its potential for actualizing our spiritual nature is how powerfully we can embrace the process and what can happen when we do. So I'll close my comments with something that Ram Dass said at the end of his book, Still Here, which he started prior to having a catastrophic stroke in 1997, February of 97, and completed after the stroke with enhanced insight into the nature of the aging process. He writes, "This book is more of my advanced scout role. These days, I'm the advanced scout for the experiences of aging. And I've come back from the scouting party to bring good news. The good news is that the spirit is more powerful than the vicissitudes of aging. My stroke was a good test for my faith. The bar was high. I came away from the stroke firm in my faith, and I know now that my faith is unshakable. That assurance is the highest gift I have received from the stroke. And I can say to you now, with an assurance I couldn't have felt before, that faith and love are stronger than any changes, stronger than aging, and I am very sure stronger than death." Here's a copy of the book. It's called Life Part 2, and the subtitle is 7 Keys to Awakening with Purpose and Joy as You Age. It's going to be released into bookstores on this coming Tuesday, December 21st. The reason it lends itself well to a study group is that because the 7 keys fit perfectly with a weekly study session. I'm going to be doing a course for Saging International next year, in which once a month, I'll be teaching one of the 7 keys. And to give you a sense of what I mean by keys, this is basically my looking back on what I've seen in my own life and what I've learned from people like Reb Zalman and Ram Dass, and both of whom lived to be about 89, and Father Thomas Keating, who I knew for 37 years before he died at 95 a couple of years ago, and some other people who have modeled for me the kind of aging that we've been discussing today. This was my attempt to put a map together of what they taught me, as well as what I learned in my own journey as a spiritual student and later as a teacher. So the keys themselves, the first one is embracing the mystery. Houston Smith at one point, one of the great religious scholars of our time, said, quote, "We are born in mystery, we live in mystery, and we die in mystery." And for those of us who look deeply at our lives and how they unfold, we see at a certain point that the rational mind has real limitations. As one teacher put it, it's a great servant, but a lousy master. Because logic and rationality have their limitations when it comes to deep spiritual insight and understanding. The second chapter, or the second key, is called Choosing a Vision, which we talked about a fair bit today. You know, what is the vision you have for what your life is about at this particular time? The third key is awakening intuition. And in this case, intuition or intuitive wisdom is distinguished from the kind of intellectual learning that is emphasized highly in most of the schools in our country. Intuition includes the intellect, and at the same time, it includes the emotions. It includes the physical body, what goes on in the body, and it includes our dreams. It includes all other forms of knowing, many of which extend and function differently than the scientific method or rational analysis. The fourth key is called committing to inner work, recognizing that each of us has certain internal obstacles and challenges to embodying and expressing our best human qualities. And these have always been a part of spiritual journeys that people have traveled, essentially. The fifth is called suffering effectively, which is a kind of odd phrase I came across years ago that was spoken by the great Christian contemplative Thomas Merton, who, after being quite a bohemian and a celebrated character of a sort, changed directions radically and suddenly and chose to become a Trappist monk. And that particular order of monastics, as some of you know, is one of the most ascetic and strict of the Catholic orders. So a friend said to him, why in the world would you become a Trappist monk? Aren't you going to suffer from all that asceticism, in effect? And Merton said to this man, I didn't become a monk so that I would suffer more than other people. I became a monk in the Trappist tradition so I could learn to suffer effectively. Meaning, see what could be learned about our deeper nature and the nature of reality with the suffering as part of the curriculum. The sixth of the keys is I called serving from the heart. That, as many of us have discovered, there's a certain kind of joy and happiness that comes in extending our interests beyond our personal desires and satisfactions. Not excluding ourselves, but recognizing that one of the sweetest kinds of joy we human beings can experience is the joy of being of benefit to others. And then the last of the seven keys I called celebrating the journey. And essentially it's based on the idea that even the notion of being a spiritual seeker has some limitations built into it, because if that's the only model we ever have of ourselves, the question that naturally arises is, at what point do we become a spiritual finder? Does the spiritual path ever arrive? And do we ever shift from becoming to being, where we can appreciate our lives as they are at the moment with a certain sense of embrace and celebration? So those are some of the kinds of issues that are covered, and there's a blend in the book of didactic material with illustrations that include poetry and personal stories from my own experience and stories of people that I've worked with. Yeah.
Is journaling along with this process a good thing? I mean, is that something you would recommend as part of a group?
For people who like to do that, I would highly recommend that. That was my introduction to spiritual life, actually, in high school. I started having a lot of dreams, and I started writing about them, and these insights started bubbling to the surface. And for much of my early life, I kept journals that helped me articulate what was going on internally. Some people are more drawn to that than others, though, Anne. So, that would be something that some people might find helpful. Others might find it more helpful to take a long walk and reflect on something, right, for example. Yeah. Let me just say one thing. Someone had a question in the chat, I just noticed. David, you had a question about the first of the models I talked about before, productive and consumer. The first one was called socio-medical with a hyphen. The socio-medical model was the first of those, just to respond to your question. If you're interested, if any of you would like to drop in at any point, our community in Boulder, the Insight Meditation community of Colorado in Boulder and Denver, has daily morning meditations that are on Zoom and available to anyone who would like to join or participate. They're from 8 to 8:45 in the morning, Mountain Time. Usually what they involve is there's a different teacher each day of the week. So a group of us got together and each of us took a day of the week. There's a 25 to 30 minute silent meditation period in which you can just be quiet and still with the other people. And then the teacher gives a short reflection or a talk on a topic, usually at the end of the silent period. Some of the teachers will start that way and then have the silence, but the majority will sit silently first and then share a brief reflection. If you'd like, the Zoom accounts change from week to week occasionally because the teachers trade days when they need to for scheduling reasons. So I send out a weekly I send out a weekly announcement of what the Zoom accounts will be for the coming week. And I know Bev has participated in that for the last year and a half and receives that. So you could get it from Bev, or if you wanted to be on the list I use, you could just contact me and ask to be put on that list. Or maybe you could collect some names, Anne, if you want, and you could give me one list.
Yeah, okay, fine.
There's a Tuesday night group that meets weekly from 7 to 9 Mountain Time. First half is a silent meditation. Second half is a talk by a speaker. And then the morning meditations are 7 days of the week. Yeah. The other thing that might be of interest, if you're interested in the kind of material we were talking about today, my website has an archive of talks that go back to 2003, and it's pretty extensive, and those are freely available and listed by topic. So my website is just myname.com, and there's a heading there that says Dharma Talks, and under that heading there's an archive, and the talks are listed by year and by topic. So, yeah.
David, one last thing. Can you describe the word Dharma for people who don't know?
Yes, Dharma is a Buddhist term that refers to two different things. One is the specific body of teachings in the Buddhist tradition, based on the Buddha's life and those who came after him. And in a more general sense, the word Dharma is used as a perennial wisdom teachings. So in the same way that, for example, the word Tao is used in Chinese, it means the way with a capital W. Or when we talk about spiritual laws and principles in the Torah, or the divine law, right? So in the broader sense, Dharma means the heart essence of spiritual teachings that the great traditions have in common.
Well, thank you very much, David.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's delightful to connect with some of you, and nice to see some of you I've seen before, and I appreciate being invited to spend this time with you. So I hope you have a good rest of the holiday season and a wonderful 2022. Okay.
Thank you.